You're listening to the SSPX podcast, and welcome to episode 31 of the Crisis in the Church series. Today we'll start with the first of two episodes with Father Paul Robinson about the doctrine outside the church, there's no salvation. And today we'll be speaking about Father Leonard Feeney and the organizations that he was a part of, the Saint Benedict Center and the Slaves of the Immaculate Heart. Why discuss this doctrine and this movement, commonly known as Feeneyism, during this point in the Crisis in the Church series? Well, because this movement, which started before the Second Vatican Council started, contains stark warnings about the current traditional movement in the 21st century. If you'd like to learn more about the series we're doing on the Crisis in the Church, or go back and revisit our previous 30 episodes, or if you want to support this project, please visit sspxpodcast.com/crisis. Now, we'll turn to our conversation with Father Robinson. Well, welcome back to the SSPX podcast and our next episode on the Crisis in the Church series, joined by Father Paul Robinson from St. Isidore's in Denver, Colorado. Hello, Father. How are you?
Hello, Andrew. I'm doing fine.
Great. Well, today we are talking about Feeneyism, which is something that popped up in mid part of the 20th century. And this is a little bit different from some of the other topics that we've talked about in terms of, well, this is more of a traditional error or a conservative error, I guess we could say. It went too far to the conservative side of things, as opposed to many of the other things we've been talking about, which are errors too far on the liberal side of things or modernist side of things. So what is Feeneyism, and why are we talking about it today, Father?
Well, let me just say, first of all, that this is a topic that hits close to home for me, because I actually grew up in an independent chapel in Kentucky that was first serviced by Father Wathen, who was a Feeneyite, what is called a Feeneyite, or a follower of the specific idea of Father Leonard Feeney. And then my Father Bitzer, who was also a Feeneyite. So this I've got a bit of a track record with this particular topic. How does it connect to the Crisis in the Church series? I think what we have to understand with Feeneyism is that Father Leonard Feeney was reacting to some bad theology before the council. This ecumenism that was up and coming in the church was becoming very popular in the church, including in the United States. This idea that everybody is saved, or non-Catholic religions are acceptable and vehicles for salvation. And Father Feeney reacted too much. He went too far by his particular understanding of that phrase that has been canonized throughout the years in Catholic circles, and that is that there's no salvation outside the Catholic Church. So he came up with a very extreme understanding of that, which was condemned under the pontificate of Pius XII, his particular understanding of that phrase, no salvation outside the church.
So he's reacting to these errors, and he's basically taking it too far, taking the idea of salvation, no salvation outside of the church. So he was closely tied to a group of people, or to a center, I guess we could call it the Saint Benedict Center, and this is going to be important in the history of Feeneyism. Is that right?
Yes, and I think it might be good for us just to firstly go over the history of Father Feeney and his group, or his groups, we could say, and then consider the particular theological question that he was looking at, how he sort of erred in that area, and the actual teaching of the church. So Father Leonard Feeney was born in 1897. He was a very gifted Jesuit priest. He was an author. He was a poet. He published various works, and he was assigned by his Jesuit superiors to be a chaplain for what was called the Saint Benedict Center. So the Saint Benedict Center was founded by Catherine Goddard Clark around 1940. And this was just a place for Catholic university students to gather and learn about the faith. So Father Feeney, as I say, 2 years after it was founded, he was assigned to be the spiritual director of the Saint Benedict Center by his Jesuit superior. And then later, in 1945, he was given permission to work there for full time. So that was just like his whole apostolate was focused on Saint Benedict Center. And as I say, Father Feeney was very gifted. He worked well with the university students. He was very passionate about the faith. He was very apostolic. He would stand up in the Boston Commons. He would preach the faith. He would, sort of stand up on a soapbox and basically, promote the faith and try to convert people. So far, so good. But unfortunately, his work with the Saint Benedict Center became just too particular, too individualistic. And they started doing things without getting any permission for them whatsoever. One thing that they did is they transformed Saint Benedict Center from being just a gathering place for university students to being an actual school. They didn't consult the Jesuits. They didn't consult the diocese. They probably said, okay, we're lay folk. We don't need the permission of the diocese. And Father Feeney was very reluctant to have other Jesuits help out at Saint Benedict Center. And at the same time, he was working up this idea that would later be called Feeneyism. He was noticing that there were this weakening of faith in the Catholic world, and he thought that there was some sort of displaced doctrine, some sort of doctrine that was no longer being held as it should, that would explain the doctrinal corruption that he saw around him. And so he looked, and in 1947, he announced that doctrine was no salvation outside the Catholic Church. That this was the dogma that was somehow displaced, sort of set aside in the 1940s, that was leading people to not have their faith as they should. And he started calling it, and Saint Benedict Center started calling it the dogma. They always referred to it as the dogma, as if the other. There's a first-class dogma, and then the rest are sort of second-class dogmas. So they definitely focused completely on that. Like, this was the solution. Like how Archbishop Lefebvre, his mindset was that what I need to give to the church are priests in order to resolve the crisis of the church. I need to give good priests to the church. For Father Feeney, he said, I need to give the dogma back to the church. And teach people this dogma.
That's very interesting. It's and this is not, correct me if I'm wrong, and I think we're going to dive into this in a little bit after we talk about Feeneyism itself and Father Feeney and his story. The dogma, like you said, is a little bit odd.
Church, that formula, outside the church there's no salvation, extra ecclesiam nulla salus, is a formula that has been canonized from time immemorial. And there's some very strong statements to that effect. Very definitive statements. So it's definitely, I would say, a de fide teaching of the church. However, what must be understood is that we have to believe the truths of the faith in the way that the church teaches them. What Father Feeney's problem was not that he was identifying this as something that needs to be believed. It was that he was giving his own interpretation to that belief, a very rigorous interpretation. So that's really where he deviated. And when you sort of see this trajectory that Father Feeney is on that leads, what I would say, to disaster. When he starts to isolate himself at Saint Benedict Center, he starts to come up with this extreme idea of no salvation outside the church, which as I say, what we'll cover in the second part, what exactly he understood that to mean. And he just goes from there. It just gets worse and worse from that point. So in 1948, I suppose the superiors were seeing that this is not looking good. And so they transferred him to another place. He said, let's get him out of St. Benedict Center. Let's transfer him to Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts. And for the Jesuits, the question of obedience is super important for that. I think it's super important for all priests and nuns and monks. But for the Jesuits especially, they take an extra vow of obedience to the Pope. So it's definitely ingrained in them. So Father Feeney went. I mean, God bless him. He obeyed orders. He went to Holy Cross College. But shortly thereafter, a couple of young men from Saint Benedict Center came and they said, please, Father, come back to the center. I mean, the Saint Benedict Center is not the same without you. It's not going to survive without you. Think about all that great work that you were doing. Please come back. And so that Father Feeney, we may say, gave in to that temptation, and he went back to Saint Benedict Center. His superiors wrote him, and they said, please, return to your proper assignment. You must. I mean, we're binding you under holy obedience to go back to your proper assignment. And Father Feeney refused. He refused each time he was asked. And then at the end of 1948, effectively, he was suspended from hearing confessions. And so, yes, he was heavily censured, and he just kept going after that, So it's sort of a sad story in that regard, because you have a very talented priest who is kind of ruined to a certain degree by this disobedience.
It is interesting, though, hearing that story, and this brings back the wisdom of Archbishop Lefebvre in setting up the society where the priests are not staying in one spot for any particular long period of time. Father, you're going to be in Denver for, maybe another 2 years, maybe another 5, maybe another 7, who knows? Yes. But you're not there long term. And, if some of your St. Isidore's parishioners come back to you, after you're transferred to Kentucky or St. Mary's or wherever, you're not going to go back. I mean, because the idea is not that this is Father Robinson's church. This is a traditional Catholic church. This is not. We're trying to get away from that cult of personality. Archbishop Lefebvre was very smart in that.
Yeah, that's exactly true. I mean, a priest can be at a certain place. He can be a very charismatic figure. The people become very attached to him, and then slowly but surely, he develops the idea that this is where God wants him to be, no matter what. Even if his superiors tell him that that's not where he's supposed to be, he says to himself, "No, this is what God wants me to do," and he sort of steps outside of the line of providence at that point. And unfortunately, that's what happened to Father Feeney. 17 days after he was suspended, he founded an order of monks and nuns, the slaves of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Unlike Archbishop Lefebvre, if we want to make that comparison with the Archbishop, he did not seek permission to found this order. He just started it from scratch, just like Saint Benedict Center transitioned to be a school without having permission. He founded his order without getting approval from the Jesuits, getting approval from the local bishop, from the Pope, or what have you. Whereas for Archbishop Lefebvre, that was completely and utterly necessary. Like if he didn't get permission to found the Society of St. Pius X from the local bishop, he said, "We're not going to do it."
Right.
So and it was a very strange thing. This sort of morphing of Saint Benedict Center into the Slaves of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, because what he was dealing with, he had a bunch of lay folk there who were married, and now he says, well, we're going to become religious. So the Catherine Goddard Clark, the founding member of Saint Benedict Center, was there. There was other married couples there, and they just decided that they were going to become religious. But the difficulty is that they had their own children. They had a family. So what they did, and this is something that's unique in the history of the church, really. I mean, as far as I know, there's no other example that's happening. Is that they decided to have the children raised elsewhere. Yeah, they sort of raised the children communally. Let me just quote what Gary Potter, who's sort of an apologist for St. Benedict Center, what he says after the Boston heresy case. He says, "The children's parents effectively ceased to exist as parents to the children, and more so as the child grew from 3 to 5 to 10 and older. Care was taken that the children had no direct or special contact with their parents, save on a half dozen major feast days during each year when the entire community would gather for socializing. The parents were seen by the children as scarcely more than another big brother or big sister. So, yeah, I mean, this is just sort of flabbergasting.
Yeah. This is, like you said, it's not Catholic at all.
There is one case where St. Nicholas of Flue in Switzerland, where he received a special mission from God, an inspiration from God to leave his family and go off and live in a cave for the benefit of Switzerland. If Andrew, if that happens to you, I would advise, you get a little bit of direction, but ultimately you follow that. If God really wants you to do that. Right. But normally speaking, we have to follow the path of providence through the external authorities. And I think for every priest, if we just get off on our own and start to develop our own ideas, and we become some sort of oracle for the lay folk, some really strange things can happen. And unfortunately, I think that's the case here, what was going on with the Saint Benedict Center and the Slaves of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. So after that, Father Feeney was suspended. He was not just banned from hearing confessions, but from saying Mass on April the 18th, 1949. And the Holy Office investigated Father Feeney and issued a decree saying that his position on no salvation outside the church was wrong. So let me just read from this letter of the Holy Office. The Holy Office is writing a letter to the Archbishop of Boston. The Archbishop of Boston is saying, hey, this is what's going on in my diocese. Can you make a decision? So it says, Your Excellency, this Supreme Sacred Congregation has followed very attentively the rise and the course of the grave controversy stirred up by certain associates of Saint Benedict Center and Boston College in regard to the interpretation of that axiom, outside the church there is no salvation. After having examined all the documents that are necessary or useful in this matter, among them information from your chancery, as well as appeals and reports in which the associates of Saint Benedict Center explain their opinions and complaints, and also many other documents pertinent to the controversy officially collected, the same sacred congregation is convinced that the unfortunate controversy arose from the fact that the axiom outside the church there is no salvation was not correctly understood and weighed, and that the same controversy was rendered more bitter by serious disturbance of discipline arising from the fact that some of the associates of the institutions mentioned above refused reverence and obedience to the legitimate authorities. It's interesting that one of the signatories of this letter is Cardinal Ottaviani. Cardinal Ottaviani has appeared quite often in this Crisis in the Church series. So you've got Cardinal Ottaviani, very, very conservative, very orthodox, signing this letter, saying that basically Father Feeney has gotten this wrong. His understanding of outside the church is no salvation is incorrect, and also that his group is disobedient. It's just simply in a state of rebellion. And not surprisingly, Father Feeney referred to that letter as a heretical letter. He called it a heretical letter. So this intervention from the Holy Office, the highest decision-making body with regards to doctrinal questions in Rome, led Father Feeney just to double down and really harden his position.
And again, still trying to make that comparison with Archbishop Lefebvre. To me, it makes a lot of sense to be able to do that. Even when Archbishop Lefebvre was having troubles, I guess we could say, with the Vatican, when things were getting heated, when he was summoned to Rome for meetings, he still went. He went unless I'm missing something, from what I can recall, every single time he was asked to go to Rome to meet with the Holy Father, he went. he didn't refuse to go.
Right. Yeah. And the Archbishop was perfectly transparent in all of his dealings with Rome. So unfortunately, this is not what happened with Father Feeney, because from that point, he was expelled from the Jesuits in that year, on October 10th of that year, 1949. In 1952, the Saint Benedict Center was put under interdict by the church. I mean, so the church is just like, we've tried to persuade you, we've tried to speak to you, it's not working, so we're just going to have to use basically the stick. So you're not allowed to have mass there. And they responded by basically accusing Pius the 12th and his Holy Office of heresy. So they sent a letter on September the 24th of 1952 to the Holy Office and accused it of holding heresy. And Pius the 12th, I mean, as a Holy Father, he was willing to entertain that things had been misunderstood, that perhaps he needed to look at this more closely. And so what he did is he summoned Father Feeney to Rome, and he said, "Come and let me hear your case face to face." He did that 3 times. He summoned Father Feeney 3 times. Each time Father Feeney wrote a letter to Rome, but did not go to Rome. And so, yes, he was basically refusing to answer that summons and speak to the Holy Father. And so he ended up being excommunicated on February the 13th, 1953. And that kind of really closes that chapter of Father Feeney's history in the pontificate of Pius XII. After that, nothing really happens between Father Feeney and Pius XII. So as I say, it's just, for me, really the whole history is marred by that spirit of disobedience and that spirit of independence. And that's what led to the disaster above all other things.
And on one hand, you can understand a little bit where he's starting. I mean, again, I'm maybe trying to be overly apologetic here, but he sees problems in the church. He sees things. He wants to try to fix them. But again, it's kind of a cautionary tale for traditional Catholics like us. There is a too far. There is a too or overly traditional that you don't want to get down into, because. And again, by the fruits, we are knowing that he's acting out of pride or out of a misplaced sense of, I'm the only one who can save this, or something.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a cautionary tale. We definitely sympathize with Father Feeney. We sympathize with his followers. We hate ecumenism too. We hate this degradation of the special status of the Catholic Church, to put the Catholic Church on the same level as the Baptists and the Presbyterians and the Lutherans and so on is very painful to see, because the Church is the one bride of Christ. And yet at the same time, to go off on our own and invent some new understanding of outside of the Church there's no salvation, and make that dogma, even against the Pope himself, a very good and Orthodox Pope, is going too far. I mean, you're going to see that later on with the era of sedevacantism. I mean, it's the same sort of thing. They're just like, how can we have popes who are so bad, and they're looking for a solution, and they reach for a very black and white solution, but one which really creates many more problems than it solves. And I think that's what happens here. Father Feeney is like, okay, I'm going to fix the crisis in the church. What I need to find the solution, sort of the silver bullet. And he's like, I think I've got it. The silver bullet is outside the church there's no salvation. And if I just preach that as rigorously as possible, then I will solve the crisis in the church. And I mean, that was his anticipation. But what happened instead is he found this sort of bizarre group of religious who raised their children in common, and live apart from their spouses, and sort of switch gears with their whole state in life, and basically consider themselves fit to excommunicate Rome or tell Rome that you're in a state of heresy. So Yeah.
Yeah, not great. So this is where things stand with Pius XII and Father Feeney. After Pope Pius XII, though, we have John the 23rd and then Pope Paul VI. What did Father Feeney ever get in contact with them later? Did they ever have any interactions with Father Feeney? How does the story kind of end?
Yeah, well, there was this prelate of Boston, Archbishop Umberto Medeiros, who I think he wanted to basically save Father Feeney, save his soul, and so he appealed to Paul VI to find a way to reconcile Father Feeney with the Church. And what happened was in 1972, he was able to do that. He was able to reconcile Father Feeney to the Church, but Father Feeney was not demanded to recant his interpretation of Extra Ecclesiam Nulla Salus. So, I mean, it's kind of paradoxical that Father Feeney was basically condemned under Pius XII, a very orthodox pope, and then he was reconciled under Paul VI, very liberal pope, but without ever having to admit that he was wrong. So, I mean, we certainly hope that he saved his soul, but we just don't see that humbling of himself. Unfortunately, he did die. I believe it was 1978. He, as they say, he was reconciled with the Church. He was buried by the bishop there in Boston. So he had an ecclesiastical funeral and everything. So, I mean, in a sense, that's a good ending to it, but we would wish that he had recanted his error before he had died.
Certainly. Well, that's fascinating, Father, and it's very interesting to kind of place this in the chronology of what we've been talking about today. And we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the true interpretation or the actual interpretation of no salvation outside of the Church. So we're going to be doing that next episode. We're going to dive into that a little bit more. But for today, I think that kind of wraps things up. So thank you very much, Father, for going into that with us. So I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Andrew. Anytime.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to and watching episode 31 of the Crisis in the Church series here on the SSPX podcast. Coming up next time, we'll continue our discussion on the topic of Extra Ecclesiam Nulla Salus, this time from a doctrinal perspective. What is it that the Church teaches on this subject? And what was the main error held by the followers of Father Feeney? And how does this doctrine relate to the current crisis in the Church? If you have a question on the topic of the crisis, please feel free to ask it at sspxpodcast.com/crisis. Please share this episode with someone who you think might enjoy it. And if they don't know what a podcast is, please show them so that they can take advantage of all our episodes. And if you have the ability to set up a monthly recurring donation of $5 or $10 or $20 on sspxpodcast.com, it would help us immensely to complete this Crisis in the Church project. Until next week, thank you for listening, and God bless you.